Welcome to a new episode of the Upper Room Church Podcast. Let's join Pastor Johnson as he shares another life-changing message.
All right, let's dive in. We're taking a close look at this sermon from Pastor Johnson, delivered at Upper Room Church just a couple days ago, December 29th, 2024.
It's a really interesting one, especially if you're thinking about it from the perspective of someone who's, maybe new to Christianity or just starting to explore faith.
Yeah, exactly. Like, imagine you're walking into a church for the first time. What are some of the things that might stand out to you from this message?
Well, right off the bat, Pastor Johnson talks about this idea of division because of him.
Division because of him. Okay, so for a newcomer, that might sound a little intimidating. Like, what does that even mean?
Yeah, it's basically saying that choosing to follow Jesus could actually lead to some, conflict or tension in your life.
That's not exactly the kind of welcoming message you might expect, right?
Right. But then he goes on to explain it using some really relatable personal stories. He talks about how his own family and friends reacted when he first became a Christian.
Oh, I remember that part. Like, it wasn't this huge dramatic falling out or anything, right? It was more about these everyday moments where things felt a little different.
Exactly. He uses this example about how his younger brothers were annoyed because all he knew how to cook back then was oatmeal. So every morning it was oatmeal, oatmeal, oatmeal.
So even small changes, like your breakfast routine, can cause a little friction when you're embracing a new way of life.
Yeah, and I think that's something a lot of new Christians can probably relate to. You're excited about this new path, but the people around you might not quite get it yet.
For sure. Then he shifts gears a bit and brings in this story from the Bible about Jesus healing a blind man on the Sabbath.
Ah, yes, the blind man. That story really highlights the whole division thing on a bigger scale. You've got the Pharisees, these religious leaders, who are furious because Jesus healed the man on the Sabbath, which was against their rules.
Right, like they were more focused on the rule breaking than on the miracle that had just happened.
And meanwhile, the blind man is just like, hey, I was blind, now I see. His personal story, his testimony is so simple and powerful.
And that's something Pastor Johnson really emphasizes throughout the sermon. He keeps saying, share your own story. Share your own experience of how faith has impacted your life.
It's about that personal connection, right? Like, hearing someone's real life experience can be way more impactful than just being preached at.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And he even warns against letting other people tell your story for you, which I think is such a valuable point.
Especially for a new Christian who might feel pressure to fit in or say the right things.
Totally. It's like, no, your experience is valid. Your story matters.
And it's those individual stories, those authentic expressions of faith that can really resonate with people who are searching for something more.
Okay, so we've got this idea that following Jesus might bring some unexpected challenges, but there's also this power in sharing your own story. It's a lot to process, especially if you're new to all of this.
Definitely. And it gets even more intense because he brings up this verse from the book of Matthew where Jesus actually says, I did not come to bring peace, but a sword.
Whoa, hold on. That doesn't sound very peaceful at all. What's going on there?
It's a tough verse, for sure.
Yeah.
But when you think about it from the perspective of someone new to Christianity, it actually kind of makes sense. Like, when you embrace a new faith, it's going to shake things up, not just in your own life, but also in your relationships.
So that sword that Jesus is talking about, it represents the division that can happen when your values and beliefs start to change.
Yeah, exactly. And Pastor Johnson even talks about how his own baby brothers felt like he was abandoning them when he started going to church. They just didn't get his new priorities.
That makes me think about how sometimes people want you to grow and change, but only in ways that they approve of. And when you step outside of those expectations, it can definitely cause some friction.
And that can be really hard for someone who's new to the faith. They might worry about losing relationships or disappointing people they care about.
Right, but Pastor Johnson doesn't just leave them hanging there. He actually shares how he was able to guide his brothers in a positive way after he became a Christian.
He talks about how before his transformation, he was kind of leading them down the wrong path.
Yeah, I remember that part. He talks about how he needed to straighten up so he could be a better influence on his younger brothers.
It's a powerful point. He's saying that faith doesn't have to damage your relationships. It can actually equip you to be a better influence in the lives of those around you.
It's not about cutting people off. It's about finding a new way to connect with them, even if they don't fully understand your faith journey.
Exactly. And that reminds me of that story about the blind man who was healed by Jesus. Even though he was healed, the religious leaders still didn't believe him.
It's like they were so stuck in their own way of seeing things that they couldn't even acknowledge the miracle that had happened.
And that can be so frustrating for a new Christian who's excited to share their experience. They might encounter skepticism or even hostility from people they thought would be supportive.
Yeah. But going back to the blind man, his simple testimony, "I was blind, but now I see," it cuts through all the noise and doubt.
And that's what personal testimony is all about. It's not about arguing or debating. It's about sharing your own authentic experience of how faith has transformed your life.
And Pastor Johnson really emphasizes that he cautions against letting others tell your story for you.
Right. You have to find your own voice and share your truth authentically.
Okay, so speaking of stories, Pastor Johnson shared a pretty amazing story about his brother-in-law, James, who had struggled with addiction for years.
It's a remarkable example of how faith can lead to these unexpected transformations. Like James went from being lost in his addiction to becoming a minister, helping others who are struggling.
Yeah, it shows that even when things seem hopeless, there's always potential for change and growth. Like faith opens up a whole new realm of possibilities.
But Pastor Johnson is also careful to point out that this kind of transformation often requires a complete surrender. It's not about picking and choosing which parts of ourselves we want to change. It's about surrendering our whole selves to God's plan.
And he makes this funny analogy about people wanting their loved ones to straighten up, but not all the way up.
It's like we have these ideas about how we want people to change, but we're not always prepared for the radical transformation that faith can bring.
And for a new Christian, that can be a little scary. They might worry about losing their sense of self or becoming someone they don't recognize.
But Pastor Johnson assures his listeners that surrendering to God doesn't mean losing yourself. It actually means finding your true identity in him.
Which is a beautiful message of hope for anyone who's feeling lost or uncertain on their faith journey.
It's about trusting that God knows us better than we know ourselves, and that he has a plan for our lives that's far greater than anything we could imagine.
It's a lot to take in, but it's also incredibly encouraging. There might be challenges and unexpected twists and turns, but ultimately following Jesus is about becoming the best version of yourself.
And that process of becoming can be messy and uncomfortable at times, but it's also incredibly rewarding. You're discovering a deeper purpose and a more fulfilling way of life. It's amazing how in this last part of the sermon, he brings it all together. All these different threads.
Yeah. It's like Pastor Johnson's giving us this toolkit for navigating the changes that come with faith.
Right. And like one of the biggest things he keeps coming back to is surrender.
Definitely. He really hammers that home, doesn't he? It's not enough to just say you believe. You got to actually let go.
And he brings up that intense verse from Matthew again, the one where Jesus says, "I did not come to bring peace, but a sword."
Oh, yeah. That one kind of threw me for a loop the first time I heard it. It doesn't exactly scream peace and love,
But when you look at it through the lens of someone who's new to the whole Christianity thing, it starts to click. Like when you start living out your faith, it's going to create ripples.
It's like that sword is cutting through old patterns, old ways of thinking, maybe even some relationships that aren't doing you any favors anymore.
And he's honest about the fact that it's not always going to be easy, this process of letting go, even if it means ruffling some feathers along the way.
But ultimately, it's about choosing what's truly important.
Right.
Putting your relationship with God first.
Yeah. And then he tells the story about his own marriage, which I thought was really funny.
Oh, yeah. What was it about again?
So his wife was super upset because their heater broke in the middle of winter.
Okay, I feel that. Broken heater is no joke.
Right. But the thing is, it wasn't even his fault. It was just like a faulty appliance. But in that moment, all she could see was that it wasn't fixed yet.
It's like that in our relationships sometimes, right?
Right.
We jump to conclusions or we miss the whole picture.
Exactly. And that's where communication is so important. Pastor Johnson was saying, even in the closest relationships, you're going to have those bumps in the road, those misunderstandings. What matters is how you handle them.
So instead of letting those things create distance, you use them as opportunities to grow closer.
Right. And that's where sharing your story comes in again. When you let people see where you're coming from, it helps them understand you better.
Like, don't let anyone else tell your story for you. Find your own voice and speak your truth.
He even talks about how the blind man's parents, they refused to speak on their son's behalf when the religious leaders were grilling them about his healing.
It was like they knew it was his story to tell. No one else could do it justice.
And for someone who's just starting out in their faith, That's a really powerful message.
Yeah.
Your journey is unique. Your story matters.
It's a good reminder that even though there might be challenges, you're not alone. You have a community to support you.
And ultimately, you have God's love and guidance to see you through.
So if someone was hearing this sermon for the very first time, what would you say are some of the key things to remember?
I think the first thing is to be prepared for the unexpected. Becoming a Christian isn't a magic fix. It might actually make things a little more complicated at first.
Yeah, because it's about growth and change.
Right.
And that can be messy.
But the good news is, you don't have to do it alone. You have a whole community of people who've been there who get it.
And even when it feels tough, remember that your story matters. Your experience is valuable.
Pastor Johnson ends by challenging everyone to let the Lord use them more in the new year. And I think that's a powerful message for all of us, whether we're just starting out in our faith or we've been on this path for a while.
It's an invitation to step out in faith, to share your gifts, to be a light in the world. Who knows what incredible things might happen when you say yes to that?
It's been a fascinating deep dive into faith and the ways it can transform our lives. Pastor Johnson's sermon offers a lot of really valuable insights for anyone on this journey.
It's a good reminder that faith is a journey, not a destination, full of twists and turns, challenges, and incredible moments of grace.
We are located at 3002 Chelsea Avenue in Memphis, Tennessee. Services start at 11 a.m. and we would love to have you as our guest this Sunday. Join us. You'll be glad you did.